Good afternoon or good morning, as the case may be. My name is Claire Bradley and I am the Director of Irish Studies here at the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. As I always do at the start of a class, I just want to take the time to ask if anyone has any particular problems with coursework or any questions that they want to ask that are not related to today's topic. If you've got nothing, that's absolutely fine. We're going to get into our topic for today. And it's a short little presentation today on something that I think people don't understand very well to do with Catholic records. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as usual. Okay. So within the Catholic Church, people can get what's called a dispensation for certain reasons that they might want to get married. One of the main reasons that we are interested in this for genealogy is that people had to get a dispensation to marry someone they were related to within a certain degree. Now, that might sound obvious. You need permission to marry someone quite closely related. Actually, it's not closely related people. So we're not talking about saying, hey, I'd like to marry my uncle. He's great. That's never going to be allowed. But it's slightly more distant relations. So what they defined it as people who were sharing 2 times great-grandparents or closer. So to put that in genealogical context, we're talking about third cousins or closer. These rules were laid down nearly 1,000 years ago. They were laid down by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 CE, which is a very long time ago. It was a very long set of new rules that came about as a part of that particular council. It also codified things like what clerics could wear. They were now not allowed to wear embroidered or pointy shoes. That was part of that council. That one hasn't survived so well. They also obliged, that was the first time that they obliged Catholics. Of course, we're not using the word Catholic at that point because we're talking about the Christian church as it was defined by Rome at that point. They had to confess their sins at least once a year. So confession came about from that council as well. And they also required the publications of bans. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. So if a couple was sharing great-great-grandparents or closer, they needed a dispensation from the church to get married. So that's not to say they weren't allowed to get married. They just had to get the dispensation. There are other reasons why you would get a dispensation to do with marriage. And the obvious three, these are the obvious three. You wanted to get married during Advent, which is the period that we are about to enter, I think, the 4 Sundays preceding Christmas in the year. Technically, you weren't allowed to get married then. So if you wanted to get married then, for whatever reason, you had to get permission. Similarly, the period of Lent, which is the 6 weeks preceding Easter, 40 days and 40 nights, but actually the 40 days and 40 nights do not include the Sundays, so it's actually 6 weeks. And you weren't allowed to get married then either. So if you wanted, you had to get permission. And then if you wanted to avoid the bans, so just remind you what bans are. 3 Sundays in a row, the names of prospective couples would be read out at Mass. John Murphy and Catherine O'Shea are intending to get married on such and such a date. If any couple or any person knows a reason why this marriage is not suitable, they are to let us know. So this is to avoid fraudulent marriages, people who are already married, something like that. You know, we're talking about a situation, obviously, in the past where most people would know the family of the person who's getting married. So it's only when people are marrying someone from outside of town or something like that that the full details are not going to be known by absolutely everybody in the area. So it would allow the time for the news to circulate that John and Catherine are going to get married, and that way someone could come up and say to the priest afterwards, you know what, actually I'm already married to Catherine, so that's not going to happen, or whatever. So you could, though, get a license to avoid the bans being read out. So that meant paying money. So this was a dispensation. And actually, it's true to say that all dispensations are about paying money. That's really what it means. We would like to do this thing. Oh, you want to do that thing? Well, then you have to pay extra money. That's really what it meant. Um, we'll let you do it, but it costs more. It's like when you go on the airplane and you want to bring, 60 kilos of luggage. That's fine, but you have to pay extra money. So the license, a reason why people might get the license and avoid the bans, just two obvious reasons. One is privacy. So people who were wealthy would go, oh, we're going to get the license, and it was a kind of a status thing. We can afford the license. But the other reason you might do it is if the bride was already pregnant and you wanted to obfuscate the conception date. You might say, well, we're not going to advertise the fact that this couple is getting married quite quickly. We'll just do it on the down low and pay the extra money. So they're the obvious reasons for dispensation. But and the name for a dispensation when people are related to each other is a consanguinity dispensation. Consanguis meaning mixed blood in Latin. So this was a way for them to make money. They were never going to allow, as I said, close relatives to get married to each other. But you could get permission to marry your second cousin, something like that. And depending on how close, it might be granted at the parish level, the diocesan level, or it might go all the way to the Pope. So I just stuck in a lovely picture here of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. They got famously a dispensation from the Pope to get married because Catherine was originally married to Henry's brother Arthur, and they were only married for 5 months when Arthur died. And Catherine later claimed that the marriage had never been consummated. And that was one of the reasons why the Pope allowed it. Now, you might be saying, well, hang on, they weren't actually related to each other. She was his sister's wife, but she was his sister-in-law. And the Catholic Church basically considered her the same as his sister, which of course she wasn't. She wasn't a blood relation of his in any way. So he had to get permission to marry her, and he was given that permission. And then, of course, he had a little fit and decided he didn't want to be married to her anymore. And so he went off and founded his own church, the Anglican Church in Britain, so that he could marry his second wife and divorce Catherine. And then went on to do the same with multiple other wives, as we know. So there is the related field of affinity, which is another type of dispensation. So these are people who are sort of kin to you, and this would be where you're not allowed to marry your brother's wife and so on. We're not talking about that today, but it is a related field. So to get this consanguinity dispensation, the first thing is that you have to know that you are related to the person you're going to marry already. And I want you to take a moment now to consider, ignoring your genealogical habit, how many of your third cousins you could identify by sight. Just, oh, you're walking down the street, oh, there's my third cousin so-and-so. Probably no one at all, I would think. And communities in Ireland were much smaller in the 18th and 19th century, of course. Before the advent of trains and especially bicycles, people very rarely travelled more than a few miles from home to meet their marriage partner. If they didn't emigrate, of course. It's a bit different. If they did emigrate, they might still marry someone from home. I've seen lots of examples of that. Two people who rock up in Chicago and, oh, we know each other. Irish people do that all the time. You meet other Irish people in America or Canada and you immediately try to establish who do you know in common in Ireland. Usually, embarrassingly, it's several people. So anyway, I digress. People usually knew the person they were going to marry for a long time before they married them. And therefore, it is very possible that they already knew that they were related. So if they didn't know they were related, obviously they're not going to go for a dispensation. And it's highly unlikely that someone else is going to stand up and go, hey, you guys are second cousins, and they didn't know about it themselves already, unless they're living in a big city and there's a chance. When I was growing up, I did actually know some of my second cousins because some of my mother's first cousins lived in the same town as us and we had met them. But my brother was actually friends with a different second cousin of ours in secondary school, which is what we call high school, or what you call high school, for a couple of years before he discovered that this guy was actually his second cousin. And it only came about because the the mother of this second cousin, who's my mother's first cousin as well, a different one, has a very unusual first name. And it came up in conversation. My mother went, "Oh, I had a cousin with that name." And then two and two were put together and four came about. So my brother didn't know that. And yet it wasn't that unusual. But when you go out to the third cousin level, it's much, much less likely that you would ever know anybody you were related to at that level, unless you were doing what we're doing, working on your family history and you're working on your DNA in particular, where we can make these connections. So you might also wonder why people just didn't lie about this, particularly when you're talking about avoiding paying extra money. And that's because the communities were small. And as I said, people would know they were related to each other already. So you couldn't be just avoiding that and getting away with it. Someone would go, "Hey, aren't you second cousins?" Or something like that, two people. And so particularly when the banns are being read out, that would be no, that would be known. The other thing to remember is that it's very hard in the modern world for us to understand the very real grip of the church on people's day-to-day lives, and that they would be genuinely afraid for their immortal soul to lie to the priest. So it wasn't, as far as they were concerned, it was not at all in their interest to do this. And later, after people were more mobile, the Catholic Church in 1908 introduced a canon law where you had to apply for what's called a letter of freedom to marry. And this meant that if you weren't marrying in your own parish, you told the church where you were getting married, "I'm from Limerick, this church is where I was baptized," and they would write off to that church and say, "Have you got this guy on your records? He has said he's going to get married to so and so, and can you just confirm he's not already married to someone else and that he is a Catholic?" And the priest in the other parish would write back to the new parish and say, "Yeah, got him. And I've noted on the register that he's marrying this person on this date in this place." And that was called the Ne Temere canon law. And it's actually very useful when you're tracking people, but it wasn't across the board. Priests didn't. I've seen examples where priests have very dutifully added in "married such and such a person in Philadelphia in 1937" or whatever, which is excellent, but you don't see it all the time. But it's very good for tracking. I find if I'm working on someone in Ireland and I'm looking at baptismal records, I suddenly go, "Oh, there's the immigrant branch, there's where they went," because I find that on a marriage record in the late 19th or early 20th century. Sorry, I find it on a baptismal record. So let's have a look now at what these notations look like on records. So this is a little one here, which I've just snipped out from the parish register, and it's in Latin. These are nearly always written in Latin, and the best you're going to hope for in it not being in Latin is that you might see something like this: second and third degree, and then some words in Latin. And when you see that, particularly if you see the degree symbol, well, then you know that you're looking at a consanguinity dispensation, and you need to try a little bit harder with the Latin. So this one says here, what does it say? It says dispensation, it says it in Latin, dispensation for secondary consanguinity obtained from the husband's bishop. And it's second, this one is second and third. This isn't what that says there. It just says, to show you what those words look like. That one is from St. Paul's Aaron Key in 1862, and it's a couple called John Joseph O'Connor and Anne Patterson. Now, second degree, that means they were first cousins. So there is a common misconception that the Catholic Church did not allow first cousins to get married. They did, it just wasn't that common. And that's because there's lots of choice. If you go into the Church of Ireland, it is way more common for you to marry your first cousin, because if they wanted to marry within their faith, there was a lot less choice for them. So your poor cousin Susan might be roped in whether you wanted to marry her or not, and particularly if there was any land involved and they wanted to keep it in the family. So this is an unusual example of a first cousin marriage in the Catholic Church, and that's in 1862. So it's quite a long time ago. We might not be able to prove the details, but the couple have two different surnames, so we can probably rule out that they're related on the fathers, that they have two fathers who are brothers. Okay, let's have another example. This one's got a little ink blot on it, which is unhelpfully over the third and fourth. And so this is a couple marrying in Kilkenny, and it is in what year? Oh, I don't have the year, sorry. I will check that. But again, it's written in Latin, and it says a dispensation has been obtained in the third and fourth degree, consanguinity written in Latin, which is it's a hard word to say. I'm deliberately not pronouncing these words in Latin because I'm not good at Latin pronunciation. Third and fourth degree is what they are there. But what does that mean? Because that's not, it's not like it's a clear explanation of how they're related to each other. I have done you a little table to explain. So when you see second degree, we are talking about a grandparent or a grandparent couple in common. So the relationship is that they are first cousins. Third degree connection is to a great grandparent, so they are second cousins. And a fourth degree connection is a great great grandparent, which is a third cousin. Now, of course, two things to factor in here. Couple might only have one ancestor in common rather than two. So they might be, it might be a situation where a man was married twice and he had children with both wives, and the first wife dies, he marries again, and then maybe descendants of those people were married to each other. I actually saw that as an example once. It's a man who'd married twice, but his first wife and his second wife were first cousins of each other. He had a child with each of those wives. The first one died very young, so they only had one child. And then a child of each of the children from each of the wives married each other, which was quite close. There's actually quite disturbingly close to each other, but I thought. So there might be only one ancestor in common, or it might be two ancestors in common. And of course, the people who are getting married to each other might not be the same level of degree removed from the common ancestor. So we talk about most recent common ancestor when we work on DNA projects, and it's the same here. And this is where the removed would come in, and this is where you would see two different numbers. So if you saw 3 and 4, you're talking about a second cousin once removed. So one person is one level, the other person is the other level. Does that make sense? I know it's a little confusing. The other thing I want to point out is that when we see information like this, it might be the only proof of it, depending on how long ago it is in the records. So we might be, if something is before about 1860, like that example there of the people who were first cousins, that's in 1862. There's only a chance that we'll be able to figure out precisely how they are first cousins. I know there's not a lot of options when it comes to first cousins, far less options than when it comes to second or third cousins. But even then, and that's in Dublin, where we do tend to have the first half of the 19th century having good record coverage for the Catholic Church, there's still a chance we wouldn't be able to figure that out. This one, the other one that I haven't got the date on, I'm sorry, but I know it's much earlier. That is probably the only proof that these people are second cousins once removed of each other that we're ever going to find. But it is still an important thing to be able to note, even if this is the only proof of it. And it particularly might come into play when you're looking at DNA, because if you know that a particular ancestral couple are related to each other, that means that there's going to be pedigree collapse in that particular part of your family tree, and there might be people who share more DNA than you would expect for the level of relationship because of this. So if you find it, you definitely want to make a note of it. So I know this is a little bit of a complicated topic to discuss, so I didn't want to go into it in too much detail, but I wanted to allow time for some good questions. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. Has anyone had any examples of this that they've seen in their family tree? You have?
I have.
Yeah.
I have. She's my third cousin, but she married her first cousin. They
Right.
both had the same grandparents. And when I was researching, I discovered that. And then, as it turns out, I ended up meeting her in Ireland a couple years ago.
Oh,
And
right.
she was really kind of I don't want to say ashamed, but she kind of said it was something we didn't like to talk about, like it was something odd or whatever, because I wasn't really going to raise it or whatever. And but she said, yeah, that, and they actually had, the parents had the same surname, so it was really strange,
Wow.
so
Okay. That
yeah.
is quite, you're right. There is a little bit of stigma is too strong a word,
Yeah.
but it's not common. Where it is common is in the traveling community in Ireland. So travelers
uh,
do practice cousin marriage quite usually. And I think that, and unfortunately, travelers are often discriminated against in Ireland. And I wonder, although I haven't done any sociological research, whether it might be because people might think they were travelers and that they wouldn't want that, which is awful and should not be the case. But they are the main categories of people who practice cousin marriage in Ireland are travellers who are usually Catholics or nearly always Catholics, or the Church of Ireland, or people who are Presbyterians, dissenting faiths. I was at the funeral of friends of mine's grandparents who unfortunately and in completely unrelated circumstances died on the same day a few years ago. It was extremely sad. And I had known these people since childhood, and I only found out at their grandparents' funeral that their grandparents were first cousins.
uh,
It was just mentioned in passing. And again, there was, when I said it to them afterwards, because I was a close friend, I said, "Oh, you told me your grandparents were first cousins." And they were Church of Ireland people. They said, "Oh, yeah, we just didn't want to talk about it. It's a little bit weird." You know, so it, even though there are definitely examples of it, it is not the usual. And if you hear about it, you'd be like, "Oh, I don't know any people who've done that," but uh, way more common that it would be someone slightly more distant to you, particularly if you lived in a rural community. There's a friend of mine who's from Bantry in County Cork, which is quite rural, and also on one side bounded by mountains. So in the past, the Zoom there is thinking I'm putting my hand up by doing that. That's funny. Um, and they would commonly be marrying people who were quite closely, well, not closely related, but there'll be some connection somehow because there wasn't a lot of choice in their community. But once the world opened up and it was easier to get over the mountain, that all changed. So not so much in the 20th century, but this particular friend is actually one of those people who could probably pick out someone on the street and go, that person over there is my third cousin. But it's at least partially because she's also interested in genealogy. Um, yes, I found a couple of examples of it in my family tree. There's no one in my direct line, but I found a few indirect people who were marrying someone and it said, "Oh yeah, second cousins" or something like that. So I always like to investigate it if I can, but it's very rare that I've been able to actually determine it. And of course, in the 20th century in Ireland, we wouldn't necessarily be looking at the church records for people in the 20th century. We're mainly looking at the civil records once they're available. If they are both available, I always look at both because there's more information to be had. But so for example, I'd often be contacting a church to see if I could get a marriage record for maybe someone who married in the 1930s to see if I could find out what their mother's names were because the civil record doesn't show that then. And sometimes they come back to me and say, "Well, because of GDPR, we can't give you that information." I had one where the couple had married in 1933. And I said, "Well, GDPR doesn't apply to dead people. And if these people are still alive, they'd be the oldest people in the world.
mhm.
We'd know who they were because they were adults in 1933. I really think they're dead." And so in that instance, common sense prevailed and they gave me the information I wanted, which was about their mothers. It wasn't even about them. Um, so you can get this information from the church. You can ask, but they're not always willing. Like there was a DNA project I was working on in Donegal. And if you've ever worked on Donegal, you know that the records are not as great as for some other counties in Ireland. And I had a couple who married in 1906, and they both had the same surname and were from the same small place. And I thought there was a very good chance that they were related to each other because it was not a common surname either. It wasn't like they were both called Murphy, which you couldn't just presume they were related. Um, and I wrote to the church and I asked them, would they consult the register if they had it? And, you know, did it note a dispensation for being related? And they just never replied.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's not that surprising, you know, if it's a parish where there's maybe only an elderly priest and a volunteer secretary who comes in twice a week, you know, it's not their top priority, unfortunately. So but it left me in a conundrum because the couple in question, the man went on to, she died, and the man went on to marry again. And I was looking for someone who was probably their son, and the sons of the first marriage and the sons of the second marriage were in contention for being the mystery person I was looking for. And there was a DNA match to the first wife's other side, to her niece. And I said, right, if this couple didn't have the same surname, I'd say slam dunk, we're eliminating the second set of children from the second marriage because there's this match to the wife's side. But because they had the same surname, I said, I can't eliminate it because if they're related to each other, that's possible. So I really did need to know if they were related. I must see if I can chase up the church. But since then, I've made progress in another way. So I'm hoping I'm going to solve that one without the dispensation information. But it's not always available to you. So that's just a little piece on dispensations for today. There is if anyone's got any Italian ancestry, there's a very good website by what's her name? She's an Italian American genealogist, Lynn. I'm going to find her name for you now, as I should, and I'll put it in the chat. Hang on. She's done a very good article on consanguinity dispensations and on affinity, with more detail than I have put in my presentation today. I'm going to stick her link in the chat for you. There it is there. So you can copy that. She's talking about Italian records in her research, but they're all the Catholic Church, and the same rules apply to anywhere where the Catholic Church is. There's no differences between Irish Catholics and Italian Catholics when it comes to things like this. So it's useful to Lynn Seraphine, that's her name. She used to be quite active online, but I don't think she is so active anymore. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now, and then I'll ask you if there's any questions that you want to ask off camera as well. In the meantime, thank you for attending today. And if you're not taking any of our courses at the moment, Donald, I know you are, please do have a look at our offers. We have a couple of Black Friday offers on the website at the moment, genealogicalstudies.com. Okay, thank you.